Yeah, that's all. There's a microphone for you too. I said that we should talk in the group, wherever. We said we should ask what the questions are for the Yom Nidai. So we got some questions, and I guess we could talk about those questions. And if anyone missed to write their questions, then too late. Or you can still ask them. But the questions were, and I wrote them down, but now I don't see them. What was the first question? The first question was, I know the first question. The first question was about the connection between the beginning of the year, Rosh Hashana is literally the head of the year, or the beginning of the year, and this concept of Yom Adin, or judgment, or tshuva, or these kind of concepts. Basically, the connection between the first two Mishnayos in Rosh Hashana. The first one talks about when the year begins, and the second one talks about when the judgment is. And they seem to be connected because they're in the same effect called Rosh Hashana. So that was one question. Second question was about a thought. I think it was really an assumption, but that it seems like the Chazal or whoever switched. At least us. Let's forget about Chazal. I'll tell you why in a second. We tend to call the beginning of the year Rosh Hashanah, and it seems like, at least in some sense, it seems like in the Tanakh, in the Torah, at least the months are counted from Nisan. So, like, is there a change here? Someone said maybe there's an ideology, like a reason for changing, and so on. That was the second question. The third question was also based on other assumptions, which are that I forget who asked each question, but that it seems like tshuva can make sense in the sense of somehow becoming a better person, if that's possible. But the other side of tshuva, which is the kapara or slicha, seems to, if we assume that things have to make sense and so on, then it seems to make less sense, or at least need more explanation. Those are the three questions. And what I propose to do is to talk about the first one. And the other two you'll leave for next year. So, or really about the first two, that's the more active, because they're really connected with the same subject. The third one seems to be, I did discuss it like my last 2 weeks of this year, and I don't know how much of my tradition everyone knows. I've sort of been dancing around that question for the past few installations of whatever I'm doing. But this one I didn't discuss recently, so we'll do it here. So, I want to make a little preface about methodology. Also, I don't know how much you know of my way of doing things, or if you agree with it or not. But I want to just to do it very shortly, so I can get to somewhere where I can have an interesting discussion. So, this is a criticism of the second question. Sorry if I ever asked it, which is asking for a history, basically. In other words, and I'll say it in a more clear way. We are taught both in the yeshiva and the very firm way, and if you go in a more so-called critical way, Jewish studies world, we're taught to think in secondary or even tertiary ways. Which means that instead of thinking about questions like, I don't know, when does the year begin? What do you think? What does it even mean? What a funny question to even ask. Or I don't know, when we talk about judgment, I don't even know what that really is about. It's about something, but instead of doing that, we start talking about what someone else said about what a third person said. That's why it's secondary or tertiary. And that's kind of interesting historically if you sort of believe that there's no access to truth or to any kind of knowledge. But for some reason, most other people throughout history haven't thought that, because then they wouldn't be what to study. But for some reason, everyone else until now thought that there is something to be known or to be taught. So instead of learning, we start doing history of everything. Right? And sort of modern critical Jewish studies is a version of that for Judaism. The history of everything, instead of thinking about anything itself. Of course, famously, since Hegel, many universities replaced their philosophy department with the history of philosophy department, and so on. So that's what I think is kind of boring to do, although it's both boring and hard. That's the two reasons why I don't like it. It's boring because, like, why is it so interesting to know what someone else does? I mean, it's not entirely boring. We could explain why it would be interesting, but in a minute. But it's kind of less interesting than being able to think about questions themselves. And it's also very hard, because questions of fact are hard. And this is a way of turning questions of meaning or reason or understanding into questions of fact, right? Instead of thinking, like, when the year actually begins, if there's such a thing as a fact about that. I don't know if there is. We turned it into a factual question, which is like, we can find documents for it, and it's kind of like looking for the keys under the light. Since we don't have access to intellect, we have access to all kinds of things written down, and we could give like a whole research about where was the first time it says something. It's like the question that everyone asks: where's the first time it's printed? Who wrote it down the first time, and why is that? Who cares? But it's something that can be answered in a sort of so-called scientific way, right? Like in the science history, at least the history of science kind of way, as scientific as that can be. But that's why it's also very hard, and it's very easy to be wrong. In other words, it's very sad. Like, firstly, it's just very hard. If you ask me, like, did Chazal switch the beginning of the year from one word to another? Okay, so you were asking me to read the whole Chazal. That's a lot. There were a lot of words. And usually, if you just make a search about the words that seem to be relevant, you'll find the wrong words. Like, there's sometimes they write things in a different language that you wouldn't expect to look. You really have to know. In order to begin to talk about things like this, you have to have a really broad knowledge. And even after that, I might miss something, and it will take me 5 weeks to prepare every class, and I have to do 5 classes a week. It's not realistic. So, unless you just have patience to do, let's go through together, start from Bereshit and all the way until wherever, which is something that people do, but kind of not possible in this framework of the amount of time that we have. So those are the reasons why I think that that's kind of boring and hard and too hard for me. So what I propose to do instead makes sense. Another thing this is why the tertiary thing, which I call tertiary thing, is even more boring, because sometimes for some reason it's very funny that people like who are supposedly critical are so convinced that these are relevant questions and relevant answers. Like, okay, so it seems like in the Bible there's one beginning up here, and in the Mishnah there's a different beginning. Now, if someone is like a good apologist, he'll convince you that really they read it out of the Bible somehow, and now you're going to be happy. Now you're okay. Well, I can do that, by the way. It's an art that I've learned to do, and it can be done, and there's reasons why I think it can be done, and so on. But like, why would anyone? I don't know. Maybe tell me why it's so cool. So, those are things that are not less interesting. So what I propose to do is to try to think about what the subject actually is, or if we can even think about it. And of course we'll mention some sources and some historical thoughts, but if I'm wrong about that, who cares? Okay, so I guess the first question is this question of time. That's why I wrote time as the header. And there's a lot of history in this, but let's try to figure out what the history is about. So we have this thought of the year beginning somewhere, or I don't know, days begin somewhere, months begin somewhere, weeks, all kinds of ways of cutting up time and dividing it, and I'll think of what else we do with it, but at least that. And okay, so what is the question, Henry? Firstly, what is it about? Like, what's the point of it? Like, what is the background? What is the context of this question? Like, which day are we on? Which year is it now? What does that question mean? Why would anyone care? Well, what's the point? And after we could think of that, we could sort of think of, and therefore, what are the different ways of doing it, and why different ones exist, or what would be the better one, or the correct one, or such a thing.
I think it's easier to view time as like circles within a graph than just as one long line, chain of events.
Because?
Because then you can refer back to specific events within these circles. It gets 365 times smaller graph too. You refer to a year rather than a thing that happened or something.
Okay, and then like what?
You're saying accounting is easier?
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Grouping things.
Yeah.
Like today I was in the bank and I had to count something and then okay, so one people alignment in the time count down. So while it's
something precedes the
in which ways are we based on seasons? Like what is that?
It's a physical. I'm saying it's a
it
physical
exists,
reality.
I mean, in some parts of the world, yeah. But what?
They need time for change and motion, progress.
Like, but what kind of progress? Like physical change, like
Any kind of
things to
change,
grow?
any relevant kind of change. If you don't have a conception of time, then how can you speak sensibly about anything developing? Everything, unless you are mile min is man literally, then you can't make sense of it. You can't make sense of anything going on around you because you can't measure the change.
So I want to make sense of things. So now we have one word
make sense of
making
things.
sense.
What would be the alternative?
The alternative to there's two questions: the alternative to keeping time, or the alternative to periodization of time, right? To keep cutting it up, to chunking it.
Yeah, if you were to view time as like one undifferentiated entity, like I don't even know if that would make sense to call it time at that point.
We could have like the Linux epoch, you know, how computers work. Like they just count from January 1st, 1971 and by seconds. Seems to work. It does have the before and after, right?
Right, you can have alternate arrangements, but you're still saying you're going to break it up into something.
But that does not broken up, right? Your computer doesn't know of years. I mean, Linux at least.
No, but it knows 1 second differentiated from the second that came
it knows
before it and
things
after.
before and after. Yeah.
So at the very least, you're going to have to determine that, like break up time in such a way that you have present, past, and future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is because, like, I know why the computer needs it, because there's like orders of operations, and like it wouldn't be able to compare two data points or something if it doesn't have the concept of time in it. Why do humans?
What
need
is
it?
time?
Probably the same way.
That's too much.
We don't even know what it is. Just how it's useful.
No, because I don't know.
You need a.
What is it useful for?
You could
Yeah,
predict and you
what
could
is it
prepare.
useful for?
You could plan and prepare for things.
Okay.
If I don't have time, how do I plan for anything?
I mean, it's not just humans who use time. We're the only ones who write it down. But bears use time. They hibernate in the winter. They hunt.
Is it using it, or they just at some point they get sleepy?
Well, they have some sort of grasp of time. They break it up into cycles, same way we do.
Is the bear aware that it's been a while since the last hibernation?
Who knows?
What context are you asking the question in? As in, why do people need time?
I guess people and beers. I somehow connected to people. We share something with them.
Yeah, there seems to be a sense that you have to do things there are some things that have to be done annually. For whatever reason, that if you do it on a different schedule, it won't work out. Let's say the harvest, like we just said. So if I don't know the years, it'll be hard for me to predict and hard to anticipate that.
I'm saying historically, we also broke it down into smaller segments just to survive, right?
So
The merchants
came-
merchants came once a week, right? So we based
I'm
our
asking,
weeks
like,
off
could
of
such a
that,
thing
and
be?
in other cultures, if they had it more often, right? We had to keep track of things just to survive.
Yeah. Correct.
It's symbolic. I'm saying we circle the sun. It feels like a nice.
No, but I think those are all just byproducts of things being cyclical. Meaning, like, I guess what I'm trying to wonder is if one could imagine, like, no cyclicality to the universe,
Right.
and everything were just
Okay, so-
progressing like linearly. Would there be any concept of a year? Like, we only have a year because we recognize that astronomically we get to the same spot every 365 days.
Or maybe that's the way we keep track of a year, but we want years to exist for more basic reasons.
No, but I think, well, seasons is probably the least granular measure that one could use. And then once you start analyzing that, you can realize that if you look into the sky, you can actually get much more precise. But I mean, you realize that it gets cold after a certain regular period, and then it starts to get hot, somewhat regular, but a little bit offset. So, I mean, let alone the fact that the sun rises and sets.
I guess that's right. I guess maybe also there are certain views or objective scales of which each cutoff is somewhat arbitrary. As I guess in the same sense, like I guess with shearing, like because I guess normally they shear, like there are bajillion exceptions because it's more of just an idea of a unit.
Okay.
The only that like there are the bajillion exceptions because like if you have a unit in some other way, you often go by that. So too, time isn't there are like there is just sort of objective scales of time, but fundamentally 365 versus 400 is somewhere arbitrary, but something within that range is.
But it has to have a certain scale.
Yeah.
Okay, so so we shouldn't get entirely lost. Let's try to do some organization of this. So first we have to like distinguish between the sort of like raw data or raw reality, called like that, and some kind of structure that either we impose on it or that exists in it. Different question, but they kind of like the form, right? Some structure of it. It's possible, or at least one way of thinking of it would be to talk about the raw, like let's say the raw sense of reality, or the raw data, or the raw matter out of which things are, which maybe have some sense of time, in the sense of not everything happening, certain time is what keeps not everything from happening all at once. Not everything happening all at once. There's some, which is already ordered, just to be clear, but we could see that as like the basic, most base sense of reality. It could be hard to deny that. People have denied that, of course. But it would be hard to deny that in sort of like a normal conversation and still be a normal human being. So that's the first thing. And that's like the minimal thing. It doesn't yet even have a use for anything. Like, you can't really do anything with it. It doesn't make sense of anything. Besides for the like very basic sense of there being some kind of line of time starting wherever or never and going on. Then, even for that, just like we see from the computer example or from other examples, right? Even for that, it's already some order, right? If we think about the world without any order, then we can sort of think of it without even that. But even from just that, there are we could talk about some uses that correspond to that. Like my computer that doesn't really need a concept of years, seems to even hate the concept. If you ever try to like manage dates in a computer programming context, they hate dates because they're too messy. Everyone has their own time zone and their own leap years, all kind of things which are sort of for human needs. Computers don't like them. They just like before and after. And computers don't hate anything, right? Anyways, but it's not the kind of thing that they are, doesn't need. And humans also have some needs for that, like for accounting, right? We have, in the Gemara it says, why do we have Rosh Hashana for Melachim? Because if you write a star, you have to know who owes who money and who was before to buy it, or there's a lien on something, and whose lien came first and so on. That's like the most basic sense, and it's useful. Like I said, it's also useful, even for people, even for like some sort of mathematical, mechanical sense of the world working. It's more or less enough for that. Like someone could tell you something like, there are no cycles actually. There's only things happening one after the other. Cycles has another level of order, at least that we impose or that exists, doesn't matter, but they're a different level of order. And this is one thing. This is like the base, at least the base that we can start from. That this has nothing to do with Rosh Hashana, only in the sense of like he said, it seems that it's hard for people to keep track of long numbers. Computers don't have that problem for the most case until they get to like year 2037, what they do. But if you have enough bits, then you don't have this problem. And then, since humans have an easier time counting things like chunks, so they chunk things up. Okay, that's the simple sense. And there's also like in the Mishnah, some of the things the Mishnah talks about have that sense. The Shonim, just so if you write a shtar, you know which day it was, and so on. what we're interested in is really something slightly more complicated, right? And that is the cyclical sense, right? Or let's say something, well, I'll say something more precise. The sense in which time, or things that we count in time, or something like that have a time, has a beginning and an end. So you'll notice the thing we just said before, as like raw data, has neither a beginning or an end, really. It only has to have a before and after. It doesn't have to have a beginning and an end. Not necessarily began and end ever. You might want to count, so you pick one data and count minus some negative and positive from it, but the counts that you look for is not something that has a limit, doesn't beginning or an end. While what we call cycles, or what we call any kind of something that we really, I will say something like this, something that we do need to make sense of things slightly more seriously, is something that does have a beginning and an end. So, and if there's a beginning and end, then you could talk about starting again. But that would be a third level. First, then we have to talk about things having a beginning and an end. Does that make sense? So,
cycles seem like the thing that at least have a beginning or an end. Like it's just a circle. That's where I would assume there isn't a beginning or an end.
So wait. So when I say something like, when we think about like in physical senses or usually in human senses, it's easiest to see. If I talk about any process or any process of something becoming or growing into what it is or to its most perfect state, maybe then falling down from that, like a human life, for example. You have to, in order to talk about a human life intelligently, or coherently, like not to make sense of it, it needs to start and begin and end somewhere. You could say, well, whatever material is made out of was all the way from whenever and will go on until whenever, but then we're not talking about human life anymore, right? In order to talk about a human life or any biological life process or even any physical process and so on, we need to cut it off from somewhere and end it somewhere. So that's all that gives us, when we talk about like, we make sense of the world by cutting it up, and the things that have process, which most natural things at least are, by cutting them up in time. Right? Otherwise everything is just one big one big mush. And then we can't even say like, a human has this and this stages, or this and this working well and not working well, and so on. We'll just be like, we would just like sort of talk in some very undefined ways, which sort of wouldn't work, I think. In order to talk about anything, we need anything that has a process, which means anything that takes time. In order to make sense of it and sort of make it into a thing, right? Otherwise it's not a thing. Me, the sense in which I exist, or which my biography, this life exists, is only in the sense in which it starts and stops somewhere. It's between birth and death, or wherever you want to start counting it from.
Right, but
somewhere it has to
but
start.
a pattern, like Zev said, doesn't need to begin anywhere. It's just the pattern runs through.
Well, it's not just patterns.
Well, we don't really think of the pattern as an infinite repeating. What we think of is precisely that a pattern is somewhere where we could start it and stop it.
Isn't
Like
that what
this pattern,
means?
No.
there's these infinite
Pattern means that it repeats. Like it's a polymer of...
Well, I'm saying that, for example, let's just say the seasonal cycle. It's not that it necessarily begins at any one season, but that given any one season, you know from the pattern what the order will be forthcoming, and also retrospectively.
But you would chop it up into 4 units regardless of which. Like you start with summer, you could start with spring, but ultimately you're going to end up with a 4-unit
you don't need
basic.
an objective starting point, ending point. To
No, I don't think he said
I
that.
didn't say anything about objective. Also, but you're talking about really about a pattern of seasons. Even one season. The fact that you may say that there's such a thing as a season was you deciding there isn't really seasons. There's just days becoming hotter and longer and whatever. The season is already, you imposed some limits on the reality and you said this is now it's summer. And we could debate when the sun really starts and that kind of things, but there's such a thing, and the constant summer demands it to have a beginning and an end. Does it? Otherwise, it wouldn't, like, how would you talk about it otherwise? He's like, say, the mush of time when it, okay.
Is that not any different than saying that things just have a definition in order to make sense of them? Like, in what sense do we...
Definitions of things that have process require them to start and end, yeah, I think so. Definitions in what someone would call like an essence or something.
Right.
If you don't want to define it, and you just define it just like living without it, then you don't need it.
But in a sequence doesn't need to have a start or an end. It's just that a sequence means everything is always in a relative position to the other things in the sequence. It doesn't have to start somewhere. Even if I want to say that the winter's not...
I didn't say that we need years. I don't know where you got that today. I mean, maybe we do, but we think about that. It's not necessarily clear to me that we need years. We do need beginnings.
Right,
More
but
importantly,
for there to be a sequence, you have to have a
anything.
beginning to the sequence, or can there just be an infinitely repeating sequence with no...
Well, the word sequence, this thing that you're calling a sequence, what does it mean?
I mean, I guess doesn't it just kind of happen in the Mela? If we exist in a year and we're going to say, okay, this period is summer, this period is spring, then by virtue of the fact that I've separated them, they have to start I guess it almost sounds tautological.
What is the question?
Oh, that's,
Yeah, I think so.
okay, good.
I don't need it to be in reality having like a space in between the seasons. I didn't say the reality has to be carved that way. But even if we say a sequence, maybe in reality the sequence just doesn't start and end. But I'm talking about a sequence as something like one pattern or one instance of that
Well,
pattern.
for example, if I said there is a sequence of seasons, and you say, what's the first season? I said, there's no first season.
I don't want it to be a sequence. Yeah, but in your sequence there needs to be some kind of order.
There is
right?
an order,
The
but there's
whole
no
point of it.
first.
Okay.
But whatever, it's relative. Whatever you're talking about as
But it's a
one,
sequence.
I can
Okay,
tell you
but-
with 2, 3, and 4, and I can tell you with -1,
Will it be a
-2.
sequence of small things, each of which have a beginning and an end?
Like each
Yeah,
season
where
is
one
beginning,
ends,
right?
where
Yeah.
one ends and two begins is a definite.
Yes,
And
where
also
one
each sequence repeats itself, so
each
that instance of the
individual
sequence would start.
constituent part has to
Although
end
you
in,
say
but that's the
it's
same
not.
for the computer. Then why is that different than the computer system?
Which one? The computer has this very, because it has seconds or whatever,
Right, so-
microseconds, whatever it counts. Yeah, in that sense, yes.
So that's the
It
same
does
thing.
have, yeah.
Each
Doesn't have a beginning and an end in the sense of like the sequence doesn't have a beginning and an end. If we talk about a season, is also a sequence. That's also like a natural process, something that is understood as like one thing in some sense. And
right.
1 second for the computer is only 1 second. That's the biggest thing that it has as one thing.
Yeah.
Assuming that that's whole.
But each unit of time or whatever it is going to have a beginning part.
Well, units of time in the sense of like, we get the complicated things. So units of time is very hard to break down to like the minimal thing because every one
Sure.
has to have like a beginning and a now and before and after, or like a present and a past and a future. And it's like, is the present the minimal thing? No, because that's not time yet. You need to have it, So, in any case.
Couldn't you be talking about like the sequence on a meta level and then just never define anything specific about it? Like, oh, there is this sequence that has such and such properties, but I don't need to.
I mean, yeah, Shalom Aleichem, Reb. Something in between the magician and Mashiach. I don't know. How would that work?
No, I
You
don't
say
need
like a color gradient,
Yeah.
where you can't point to any
I have a
particular
color
point.
wheel, like a line of colors that goes on forever, or like a rainbow, like color
good,
gradient
yeah,
type.
So
And yeah,
it's a
most people
continuum.
claim that there's 7 colors or something in the rainbow. Right?
Right.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. Like, you ask them where does one color start and where it ends. Well, even if it's fuzzy, somewhere it starts and it ends, right? Otherwise, you would like, I don't know, it would simply make it have a difficult time with.
I think this is somewhat cultural though. Like there are certain cultures that have like 8
Okay, wait.
flavors of
That's
blue.
possible.
The 50
I
type of
didn't
snow.
say anything about how would be the correct way, or if there's one correct way, or even if it exists in the like base reality. All I said was that it seems to be important for anything that any process. I think that are not process, but understand. But anything that changes, anything that has a process, which is to say that has time, needs in order to make sense of it as a thing instead of like as a whole, one in a series of infinite movements. We need to pretend at least that it has a beginning and an end.
Don't you have the same problem with discrete objects?
Yeah.
Like don't have to
In
say where
space.
the bottle stops and where it.
In space, we have the same thing.
Okay.
But don't necessarily have. I mean, if we talk about it only as like something that takes up space, then you only have to cut it off in space. Of course, most things in space have a history and time also. Maybe all things. But yeah, of course.
So is there such thing as a current process if there's no end yet?
Well, we can imagine that in our mind we see though this person is something that will end.
And the imaginative end counts as an end?
Yeah, it's understood. The thing that if I take a human being, I understand a human being, a human life, let's say, as something that is born and dies, like something that has a beginning and an end, and that's what allows me to make sense of it. Or else they talk about it intelligently. Otherwise, it would be very hard. It's like just like it would be very hard for us to like exist in a world where things don't have names. Although, did anyone ever see a name on something? Like, do we like ever like send a spaceship somewhere or look at a microscope and like there's a tag?
I mean,
This is an atom. Oh, If we wouldn't have names, then it would be kind of at a loss for making sense. I think.
You can talk about procedures that don't necessarily, or concepts that could be mapped onto procedures that don't necessarily have an end, like making like all the counting numbers.
Well, but
Yeah, we have difficulty with that actually. There were like some famous, I forgot who actually didn't believe that numbers go on forever. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
One of the big mathematicians,
I don't.
just denied it. Aristotle sort of denied it in some way. This is actually a problem. Huh? And if there isn't a problem, it's because people have found ways to limit it. We found mathematical ways of playing with infinite series and so on by giving them some kind of limit. Not necessarily the series, but some way of working with it, which is defined.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess what I think what mathematicians would say is that the process never actually completes, but we can still like analyze the object abstractly as a process that never ends.
So it's not clear. This is we're not. We're gonna get stuck into this thing. We're getting to the question of reality. Like, is the reality that it doesn't end? I'm not very worried right now. I'm not worried about that. But for sure, we analyze some relation between and take one side of the process and sort of can project that infinitely or so on. But we're still thinking of one thing when we. Maybe it's possible to very much abstract your mind and think of something without that. But anyways, for most actual things, we don't manage to do that at least. Maybe it would be nice, like someone to go, like I said, Shalom Aleichem and Mr. Yid, and that's like saying part of some process. I don't know. Mr. Yid, Mr. One Self creature, who now is a lot of cells. Like that. Most people at least pretend that discrete things exist, and also that discrete amounts of time exist, as a sense, and in the sense of as part of things that have processes that begin and end.
When you say exist, you mean in the absence of like human
I don't know.
superimposition?
I don't know. That's a different question. I'm not too worried about it right now.
Yeah.
Not too worried because I'm anyways going to end up at very cultural things, which are definitely only exist in human consciousness. But in like the most basic sense, or art forms and things like that, it's not very relevant. I mean, not worried about that right now. Right. So what we got to is that in order to make sense of anything, we need for things to have a beginning and an end. So that's step 2. This is why of course we're jumping here, but if you want to talk about the beginning of a year, then it seems like if there's such a thing as a year, why would we need such a thing is a good question. I mean, you told us why we have such a thing. It definitely needs a beginning and an end, otherwise it doesn't work. You could say pick whichever. I didn't say which part of the circle that you pick as a beginning. Might be arbitrary, but we can't talk about the parts of it or their relation to each other without at least imagining a beginning and an end.
I mean, I guess I don't know. It still like seems like you could talk about the process, whatever process you're talking about. Like, does it need to have?
I mean, if you talk to I don't know, an astronomer or something, telling you like which degree of the sky something is in, and tell them, well, that's you're talking about longitude and latitude, okay? And just because some guy decided that with 0 is going to be in Greenwich, but you tell them, okay, so let's try to talk about without it, because this is just imperialism, the British decided that everything has to start from them and so on. So he's going to tell you, okay, so let's start from somewhere else. You say, no, I want to start from nowhere. So how do you want it to work? I can start from somewhere else. I can start from wherever you want, maybe. But I can't start from nowhere. At least if I want to work with this thing that in reality maybe doesn't have a beginning. It's a circle. The reality of the circle doesn't have a beginning. But we do have to be able to make sense of it and pretend that it has a beginning.
Right. I guess are you making a distinction between that model and just saying, okay, here's a process that I can define. I can understand all of its constituent parts. Beginning or not beginning, I'm just saying this is the state it's in right now. And we don't necessarily need to define a beginning, unless you take that as synonymous as defining a beginning. But
yeah, we're going to be imagining the beginning, even if we don't really believe that there's a beginning.
But just because it's useful in terms, like wanting to talk about something is just useful. Like,
yeah, for sure. It might be, we can get the states where, the levels where it's needed.
Meaning,
but
can you say like the beginning is in contrast to the end, or the middle? Summer is summer because it's not cold.
well, summer itself has a beginning and a middle and an end. And without that, it wouldn't really work. The idea of summer, or talking about summer.
I guess like
It's not enough for it to be before the thing between spring and fall, is what I'm trying to say.
There's something,
There's something called summer,
That's
which
some-
starts and ends, and therefore has something in between the start and end, which we call the middle.
so let's say winter didn't exist, there would still be something called summer, you're saying.
Well, I don't know. What is this thing we call summer? It's maybe just a relative thing where it's colder, warmer than the winter. Whatever that thing is, it starts and ends.
But like we can understand, like if we're just talking about orbits, like the year is I mean, these are all, one could argue, human projections, but like the year is obviously a convention that we choose, okay, it's gonna start January 1st and whatever, but we can talk about orbits without needing to define, okay, here's where the planet starts in the orbit.
Well, if we want to talk, yes.
Like, I guess
no.
I
Yes and no. In other words, only halfway, because firstly, if you want to talk about, and I don't know exactly about this, but I mean, obviously when people talk about orbits, they do talk about like the quarters, or usually we do 360 degrees or something, right? And if you want to talk about like where it is in an orbit, you have to pretend that it has a beginning. Also, the concept of an orbit, that's one thing, but that maybe you could say it's a practical thing. Also, the concept of an orbit is a full concept. Because when you say orbit and you say, well, it orbits forever, that's not an orbit. An orbit is something that starts and comes back to the same place. And that's where it's finished. Now, where that place is, maybe there's no such place, so we just choose it arbitrarily. But an orbit is something that starts and ends at the same place. Or circles around the same thing, however you want to define it. It's not just moving. It has a meaning, it's a circle. You could imagine it, you could see it, we have pictures of it and diagrams of it and models of it and so on, right? It's something. And also something that has a beginning and end, which are the same, very interestingly. But it's still the same one, that's the beginning and the end. It's important to call it the beginning and end, otherwise it's not an orbit.
But I guess, and maybe this is what I'm getting stuck with, but like beginning kind of presupposes that there was, at least it calls to my mind, a state prior to where it did not exist. So hence we have to call this point.
No, I don't think it needs to be that.
So then in what sense, like let's assume that the Earth.
This orbit, or like this number orbit, the Earth's orbit 10,900 or whatever.
Right, but this orbit
didn't exist before.
This orbit is not a continuous thing, but the orbit itself, is. So we can say, okay, this year, for example.
Yes, but when we make sense of a concept of an orbit, we think of one first. You can't do it without thinking of one. You can say this thing, orbiting, keeps on doing it again and again and again and again. And like the basic physical thing, whatever, doesn't care about the fact that it starts again. But we do care, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't call it an orbit. We just say the turning or something like that. And turning is not an orbit. Even orbits, the concept of an orbit has a beginning and an end. Even if the existing one doesn't. It keeps on going to the next one. We say orbit number 1, orbit number 2, okay. How do you get from number 1 to number 2? Maybe the beginning and end are the same, that's why it's an orbit, otherwise it would be a line.
Right.
But
No, I mean, you're saying if you want to count orbits and you say, oh, we're let's say a halfway through our orbit or 1.5 way through our orbit, and there has to be,
But that I don't have a problem with. I guess the only thing I'm talking about is when we talk about all processes, even cyclical ones, need to have a beginning and an end in order to make them intelligible.
yeah, because they talk about one cycle, and we say that one cycle keeps on repeating.
to count how many there have been.
But again, but then you're talking the individual cycles themselves. Are those?
Like you're saying, you could talk about it just as a circle, but if you want to count how many you've gone through, then you have to have some.
I don't even know if you want to talk about the number.
A cycle is something that has a beginning and end. Even just one cycle.
Wait.
A cycle is a full thing. It's a full revolution, right? It happened. Something happened. What's this something that happened? Nothing. If you wouldn't have a concept of beginning and end of a cycle, there wouldn't be cycles either.
No, it's just always.
In other words, we talk about making sense. Like go back to. You want to talk about the seasons, right? Which are probably the first place where people know the cycles of the sun, right? Or the moon, right? Something like that. And you say, the medrash, it's like medrash like this. It's cold, it's hot. The days are longer, the days are shorter. That doesn't make any sense. And then there's a medrash that says, oh wait, that's how the world is finishing, but that's already some position. So things seem to go in a pattern. They're getting shorter, maybe they can stop it entirely. Or whatever. But just even without that, even with less than that, you just say, I don't know, it's hot, it's cold. There's no science, there's no knowledge. There's just hot, cold. That's basically where a cat lives, right? I mean, I don't know cats. A cat. We assume that little children live that way, right? My child doesn't know that this. I mean, you go to first grade, then they start propagandizing in you in the concept of time. Right? You're in first grade. What does that mean? You're 5 years old. Well, in fact, like, oh, now we start believing that there's such a thing as time and they have cycles and years. But before that, it was just like, I'm here, I don't know, I'm hungry. That's the thing.
Once you go through a few sets of seasons, you start catching up.
Okay, good. So, but what are you catching on, right? You catch on. So now the guy is smart. Let's say, by the way, I don't know, by taking Homo sapiens 10 million, who knows how long to catch on. We're very privileged to think that these things are obvious, but and even some of the things that we take for granted, of course, 500 years ago, people thought were not organized in the extent that we think they are, right? And like maybe it took who knows how long, and you like, yeah, and like you start noticing, okay, it seems like the spring comes back. By the way, it's very hard to figure out how often it comes back. You don't have the concept of time to count it by, right? We have a calendar, we say like, well, each March it seems like the spring comes back, whatever. Right? But how do you do it without? Like the spring keeps on coming back. I get that. Okay, so something like
count the days from the solstice. Count the days from the solstice, from the winter solstice.
Yeah, but like that again. Now you have. We're thinking very much. We're very privileged, right? Check your privilege, right? Yeah. You have the concept like, okay, it seems like the days get shorter and there's the equal days, and now they keep on coming back. But if someone doesn't. Someone invented, I don't know if someone invented it, but like maybe there was the first guy that figured out there's such a thing as a yearly cycle, and everyone was like, wow, you must be amazing. Which God told you this? No, so everyone was like, the days, every, I don't know, yeah, if you have memory, okay, of course, we need memory, if humans have memory, they'll like,
but you can
I remember when I was
perceptual things. If you see where the stars are in the sky,
of course, there's perceptual science for this, but the concept of counting is not perceptual.
What about
a cycle? Is not perceptual. Nobody ever saw a cycle. You need to have memory and imagine what you remembered from yesterday, and then you could sort of conceptualize or imagine a cycle, like make a picture of it, or a diagram, with a picture of a movie.
But if I go a few years and I count from when the stars were in this position, I see, oh, that's when the star was.
That's what happened, but it's genius. Whoever figured it out. From zero.
Is it any different than the fact that they realize that the day is going to start again tomorrow? When the sun goes down, they think that the world's ending, and then they realize, they pick up on that cycle a lot faster.
That's true. They figured out the day and night. That's even more basic.
Right, and from there you can figure out how many days. You can start counting days. I mean, yeah, easy for me. Check the book.
Yeah, it's easy because you know, Plato said God created the stars so people should learn numbers. Isn't that a mess? It's kind of interesting. Not very obvious. We're thinking backwards. Yeah, that's interesting. But anyways, what I'm trying to get at with this whole description was that therefore the act of making sense was someone who came up with the concept of a cycle, which is a defined concept. Now we can go backwards and say, well, to what extent does this exist? To what extent are you making it up, and so on. But someone like was, wait. I remember that last time. I don't know, something like, and you can realize why we like laughing at ancient people for all their funny things, but like, we notice that each time there's an eclipse, there's a new king. Or the king dies, that was the Babylonian belief. Now, we don't know what causes what, but it's like, very advanced, but there seems to be something going on, right? And now you come up with it. Now someone at some point realized that these things are not random. Things do have an order. They do return to themselves, right? This is really amazing. The Soviet Tzira was really impressed by this concept. Not the Muslim it was like the invention of the wheel, not the wheel, the cycle. Right? The wheel, by the way, was also invented at some point. For a long time, people didn't have wheels. Somehow they schlepped everything with racks all the time. And a cycle is this really interesting thing, but it is a thing at least, right? But it's not, you can't really put it back. The whole point of it was to realize that we could cut it up. That we do have something like, it's not just, I don't know, someone could say, maybe this was like one theory, like the god, the Greek story of the goddess who goes down to the underworld every winter and comes back up and so on. Maybe that's what causes the spring. And sometimes she's mad at her, what's the guy?
Eurydice?
Hades or whatever.
Yeah, Demeter, that was her, Persephone was kidnapped. In any case,
Eurydice, I thought.
The guy that kidnapped the girl. Anyways, and her mother comes and crying her, and this whole stuff. Anyways, Why am I saying this? It's a Greek myth and also a Near Eastern myth, which is Medrash Satan, which is mentioned. In any case, yeah. And maybe then you could then that person didn't really realize there's a cycle, giving there's a defined cycle, but he would say something like, if you get, right? It's just happens to be that they made a deal with the guy over there that for half a year she live here and for half a year she live there, and who knows if tomorrow they change the deal.
Well, that's already
so he doesn't really have a cycle.
Explanations to it.
This is the explanation of the myth.
No, but the myth is an explanation of the cycle, no? It's trying to explain.
But you don't need to have a cycle.
How do you know?
To be true.
That's what people that know about cycles say.
The myth is not necessarily secular.
No, it is. Every 6 months she goes down.
No.
It doesn't have to be secular, but you could just say when he's happy with
But
her.
the myth is not
the cycle is
what the myth is not an explanation of a cycle. What it is an explanation of what causes the spring to come and keep on coming, and why is there in other words, it's an explanation of something more basic, of something like why is it sometimes cloud and sometimes cold? Why does grain only grow half of the year? The answer is that the grain is missing half of the year. That's why. Right? And then some smarter guy or whatever came up and said, no, it's just a cycle. I don't know, just the cycle. I don't need an explanation. I don't know these things, but it's a different concept. It's there's such a thing called a cycle. And the sun travels through the zodiac or whatever it is, and something. By the way, you can't see the sun traveling in its yearly cycle. We're also something that we're really brainwashed by our calendars. Everyone talks to you about a solar calendar. There's no solar calendar besides for the sun in relation to the stars, which is kind of complicated to even figure out. Right? So in any case, a cycle is a thing. It's a concept that maybe took who knows how long for humans to figure out, or whatever it is, and it's something that begins and ends. It's important.
What do you mean?
It's not something that just is undefined.
You mean it's like an abstraction
concept,
over the thing, over perceptual reality? What do you mean?
Yeah, you never saw it. Nobody ever saw cycles. We saw it in a. This is a weird thing. This is like something you call something like we see it in the movie way. I don't know, right? And a movie is just an illusion because it's a bunch of stills very fast. But we see it in an understanding way. It's somewhat perceptual, somewhat how you want to call it exactly. The boundary between these things doesn't really exist. But it's an accomplishment to figure out the concept of a cycle. And it's something that begins and ends. That's where I wanted to get. Has a limit. A limit means it starts and ends if it's in time. It's a spatial thing, then the limit starts and ends this way. But it's a time thing, then it's something that starts and ends.
And in terms of the cycle and the seasons, it has to be 4. It could be a cycle of. It could be a cycle of 6 seasons, right?
It could be whatever you want. I mean, why is that? Yeah.
It's just the color gradient.
Can you
say
certain cultures have 7
Right, the boundaries are completely arbitrary.
Yeah,
completely, yeah.
Cycle.
But the point is they're
Count is one thing.
But it's
years based on the axis.
Or you're saying a cycle?
No, each
It could be 12, for example.
Right, I figured the shortest pattern you can actually construe out of the seasons.
You could do 2. It's getting colder, it's getting hotter, it's getting colder, it's getting hotter.
Right.
or just not
Or just-
exactly, or just not divide between summer.
Right. Getting
and
colder,
spring.
getting hotter.
Yeah.
They're just equinoxes.
So, anyways, things like this thing of years beginning and ending, or any cycle beginning and ending, forget about years, is a very basic human thing. One of the things that make us human is that we begin and end. Animals don't begin and end, right? They're not mortal even, right? Yeah. Because I'm serious. Animals are immortal. No animal has, it doesn't know. They might be afraid of dying, but I don't think they know of the fact that they're going to die. And therefore, there's only animal kind which doesn't end, or at least maybe unless they go extinct. But besides for that, it's immortal. Humans are the only mortal creatures, which means we're the only ones that have beginnings and ends, which really have years that begin and end. Have Rosh Hashana.
The American bison has no awareness of its former territory.
That I believe.
Or maybe they cry every year, there were so many of us once, and now.
If you're alive now, it might tip them off.
It still tries to avoid death. How does that happen though? If it has no.
Well, even doesn't try to avoid death. There's nothing to do with that.
No, but we
I don't know.
They've evolved to behave in a way that avoids
It's
death.
just hard to know what the animals know. That's a problem.
Metaphor with like cells of an animal. Yeah, cells of a who human. knows what
cells of a human don't either exist, are also immortal in the same way. Yeah. Things that compose you, they're even more mortal because they die quicker, but they don't know that.
Why does joking? He wrote a thing about animal consciousness.
Well, I mean,
It has an end.
yeah, but I'm talking about the beginning. Because we said the beginnings and ends are not things that exist, or at least not things that can be seen simply. You need to have a kind of mind, some kind of mind for them to exist. Notice them at least, or to make for it to be for you at least. Someone could say that the world has to have a mind for it to exist in the world, but that's the question.
Do we answer what the point of the organizing was?
The point is to understand.
To understand what?
I think, of this level of organization. In other words, as opposed to the before and after, of which the point is to work, to be able to predict things, and to, well, predict things is another thing, to be able to know who has to pay who, and their debts. The point of cycles is just to make sense of things.
But isn't it
to understand things?
Aren't you understanding it because you superimposed a cycle?
What?
I mean, you're just understanding the cycle that you superimposed onto, like you said, some sort of undifferentiated reality.
Right, and now I say I understand it. Before I didn't understand.
But you don't understand it. You understand the thing that you superimposed onto it.
Okay, that's why the theory of subjectivism doesn't make sense. Because then we would be wasting our time. It would be innocent, right?
Or the only way you can make
that's
sense
why whenever
of it
you say
is-
that, I'm just saying that because I don't want everyone to say, oh, it doesn't really exist. But really, if you claim to make sense of yourself instead of the world, then you're wasting your time.
No, but if you say it's already there, then we didn't come up with a cycle. We just saw what was there. There are cycles.
Yeah, we know this now. We understand them.
Right.
And now we understand. I don't know if the beginning and end of the cycle really exists. That's a little more complicated. They, in some sense, really exist, but when it's something like an orbit, it doesn't really exist. In life, they do really exist. People really die, I think. But
Well, then they go back.
yeah, okay, but it's a cycle. It is really a stop. An orbit doesn't really stop. It doesn't stop.
So you're saying that the point of declaring that there are
Which is why
cycles.
the ancients all said that the heavenly bodies live forever, and that those are the gods.
So you think the point of declaring that there are cycles is noting the reality that there are cycles?
Yeah.
But that still doesn't answer why we have some to talk about some cycles, not other.
Because
The
then we
infinite
understand-
amount of other cycles we don't know.
No, I just talked about why cycles begin and end, or why anything begins and ends to make sense. In order to make sense of anything, we need to start and end it. We need to give it a beginning and end, or notice its beginning and end, whichever way you want to say.
Okay.
That's all. I then prove to you which one,
If
where
there-
to start it and so on. That we didn't talk about.
Well, if there isn't actually, in reality, a beginning or end, I mean, the cycle you're saying is a real thing, but the beginning and end might be a construct. Then, why is
Yes,
it
but
important to understand?
because no, it depends which kind of beginning and end. Okay? Depends which kind of beginning and end we're talking about. A cycle, even a orbit, has a beginning and end actually, because whatever an orbit is, it's something that's a full thing, and there's not more than it, right? It's not less or more than it, right? It's not 1.5 orbit, and it's not 3/4 of an orbit. It's the full orbit, right? What it doesn't have is a place, because it doesn't stop, right? Things that stop do have a real beginning and end.
I mean, you're saying it has a circumference. It has like.
No, there's a boundary. There's a boundary. There's a
Well,
place
it's
where
not the
it starts
boundary in
and stops.
space, right? If you go in space, it's
No, I
square,
know
in
that.
time, right? It has a, of course, it has boundary in space. Although
Yeah,
you can go
sure.
around anything, but it has also a boundary in time, but not a. Maybe you could say something like people used to say, each moment is really the beginning. It doesn't have, in some sense, doesn't have a past, present, and future, because it's always beginning. It's always in the same moment of time. There's the questions of eternity and so on, but so what it really has is there's really such a thing as one cycle or as one orbit. Otherwise, there wouldn't be orbits at all, or we wouldn't understand the thing of orbits at all. What it doesn't really have is a specific place where it starts.
Within the
Because for that to really exist, it would need to stop, and it doesn't stop.
But to understand it, you need to pick a point.
In order for us to get to understanding, we pick a point and we pretend that it starts and stops there. Or we start counting the degrees from there or whatever it is. But it doesn't really exist. That's the difference. Makes sense? Unlike others, there are things that do start and stop. Like,
I mean,
I would say
the-
most popular things do actually really start and stop, at least in some sense.
I mean, I think just like very simply, like anytime we talk about any sort of motion, we have to first define an origin. Because then you can say, if you don't define an origin, then you can't make sense of any sort of change because how do you know it's changing?
You need like a beginning state.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm now making sense of what you were saying before.
Yeah.
Is that
Change isn't, if it just keeps on changing, then it's,
right? So
you
in other
only
words,
can't talk about one change, or one series of changes that pick one feature.
so we have to
or
define. So some sort of origin is defined arbitrarily, and we realize over time that it happens to come back to the origin. Anything that we're calling a cycle, that's the definition of a cycle. But I think what you're saying is that in order to make sense of it, we have to define an origin.
For us to make sense of things.
Correct. And that's what we're calling a beginning. And in the case of a cycle, it's
in the case of a cycle, it doesn't really have a beginning. We just, in order to realize that there's a cycle, we have to pretend that there's a beginning.
But
in the case of a non-cycle thing,
And it's also the end, though. In itself.
yeah, cycles are the things that, which is another way of saying that it doesn't really have a beginning, right? Anything whose beginning is also end. So is that the end or the beginning? Like, which one is it? No, it's neither. But it does have a beginning and end in the sense of, and in some abstract sense, like you said, there's circumference. In the whole cycle is one thing. In the sense that it's one thing and it's not more than it and less than it. No, something like that.
But every time we talk about a cycle, we theoretically can pick a different point and start with that point, then start with that point. It doesn't have to be the same point.
Yeah, true. And only that we can understand that in reality it doesn't. We even understand that and still understand that there's such a thing as one cycle. In order to count, to point to you or to tell you at 3 o'clock, and you know where things are and so on. Yeah. So yeah, this is why things having a beginning and end is very important. And this is also why we have all these kinds of cycles. So now we have to go from here. Now you tell me what time. How much time do I have? What time is it?
Well, just a question about it not really having a beginning.
Yeah.
If theoretically, we're assuming the orbit is an infinite orbit, that it's always been going on.
Oh, if it's one started, then it's very good,
then
very good. If this is the question of the eternity of the world, right? If the Jews like to talk about the world as if it once started, and therefore, which is, to be clear, kind of weird, if you realize what I was saying now, because when we understand the understanding of an orbit, I mean, of course, it depends on in ancient times it's weird, and Newtonian science maybe less weird, but if there's such a thing as an orbit, and it doesn't require a beginning and end, the point of it is that it keeps on turning. And to say, like, when did it start? Maybe it happened that stars once, there was some collision of two stars that pushed this into that orbit and so on, but that's not interesting to the understanding of the orbit. You actually understand it less when you talk about the beginning of that. Make sense? In other words, it's not relevant to the understanding of the sun revolving around the world, and one day God put the sun there. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but that's not helping us understand where what's going on. What's going on is actually an infinite process, which is of a bunch of cycles, but discrete cycles, but keep on returning to the same place. But it's just one. It's not a process that really has a beginning and an end.
Even though it might actually, or whatever.
Yeah, that's like a question of history, not a question of we don't need that.
To understand the cycle, right?
And even if, so in other words, even if it does, and if you realize this, it's not a lot of things that people have been talking about for 1,000 years, but even if it does, in other words, we realize, so in other words, even if it does, and the Gemara talks about this, right? The question of when the world is created is really sometimes an astronomical question of where should we start counting. And even if we, in the way that they talked about was like, so the first, just to connect to your question. Like for example, okay, so the Tutanim arguing about if the world was created in this and that and Tishrei. I'm pretty sure this was like a scientific discussion in the sense of people trying to make sense of the cycles of the world. And now, it is true that we need to start somewhere in order to make sense of anything. And there was an ancient debate among astronomers. I know this on ChatGPT because I asked it yesterday. And then I looked it up, it seems to be true. I asked some people that also know this and asked them. And and then I found the sources, don't worry. It's just a starting point. But there's a debate going on for a long time in the ancient astronomy. And astronomy is like one of the first sciences because this is where we start making sense of the world in these ways. And now there was a debate of where to start the year. And of course, in some sense, it's an arbitrary debate because you can start it wherever you want. And just by the way, until people realize that. But and some people started it, and actually there's I think I know of, we know of like even the culture that we have, we know of three ways, more or less three places to start the year, which is spring. Like there's really four places logically to start, right? All the equinoxes and the when the days, the longest, the shortest. Yeah. Right. So those are the four places where it will sort of make sense to start the year. And how is it called? Tradition, like our astronomy, which is a descendant of Babylonian astronomy, always starts it in Nisan, in spring, when the sun enters, what's it called, Mazel Tov, Aries. And there were other traditions that started in September, when the sun enters Mazel Tov, Libra. And there were other traditions that started in the middle of the winter, which is how we have our Roman years, more or less January, right?
What's the svar?
There isn't anyone that starts in the middle of the summer for some reason.
What,
I know, maybe that's just too hot.
what's the rationale for starting in Libra?
So the same one as starting in Nisan, because it's the equal day and night.
But no, isn't Nisan also just because that's when the spring is and things are going back to life instead of dying?
Okay, very nice. Yeah, but that's not a real thing. In other words, that's not an astronomical thing. That's not a precise thing either. It's sort of, and also I'll tell you about this in a second, but just to get back to you. Therefore, when the Tannaim were arguing about where the year started, I don't think they were arguing about history in the sense of, I mean, maybe us also, but the reason why they get into this whole question is that in order to make sense of anything, we need to start somewhere. And since the Jewish tradition at least talks as if the world has a beginning, very important for us. And it's important, you understand why it's important, although it's abstractly important, not literally important. Right? So the first Parsha of Bereshit talks about the world having a beginning and a cycle, and the same, like 7-day cycle. Which of course, that's not really the real cycle, you have to come to Parsha for the cycle of the season. But the 7-day cycle is kind of one that doesn't exist in nature entirely. But in any case, it talks about cutting things up and even having a beginning and an end in some sense. And that's important because otherwise, like, when someone says, like, trying to make sense of the world, like one of the ways to formulate that question would be say, where did everything begin? And we'll get to God in a second maybe. But the point is, since this is true, even if you don't believe in there being a literal beginning, like Aristotle or someone would say that the world was eternal, you still need to talk about a beginning to make sense of anything. And therefore,
When I debate these 2 points, then any point is arbitrary, no? As we just been.
No, but there is need. We conceptualize it as something that begins and ends.
Even if any day. Why was the discussion between the two?
Wait, but I'm just saying that. Therefore, since the language of Judaism talks about when things began, the language of the Torah talks more or less about like that. There can't have a circle. In general, in the Jewish sources, until you get someone that realizes that there's such a thing as cycles and that don't begin and don't end, you need to wait until the Sefer Yetzirah. Which literally is really impressed by this. And he probably read some, nobody knows, Greek or Persian or something, science. But everyone until that has this very linear conception of, at least I don't think it's a real difference, like I'm saying. And therefore, when they have this debate of where we should start the year, they say, okay, so the way it gets formulated is, so in which month did God create the world? That's a really weird question to ask, right? What do you mean, which month did God create the world? Before he created the world, there were no months. Right?
No,
everyone knows that. Okay, so which was the first? So, in other words, when we count, where do we start counting from? Right? How do we make sense of the world? We need to start somewhere. And the logics that they give are sort of the same logic that anyone would give, like you were saying. It's sort of, and the reason why the Babylonians started in the spring was because they like the sun very much, like all humans must like the sun very much. Some might think most things seem to help us a lot more than the moon, a lot more than darkness, a lot more than all the other planets. So they said this seems to be the season where the sun begins its reign, and therefore we should honor the sun by declaring the beginning of the year to be when the sun begins its reign. They have the word for it, the sun, and there's an astrological word, the exaltation of the sun. So the astrologers call it. And that's the reason why they did that. You can see why this is problematic. The other people would say something different. They would say something that this is only what you see. But if you think about, there's two ways to say it. Think about, number one, the actual yearly work cycle doesn't start in the natural cycle seems to start in spring. but it's really the combination of what you planted in the winter. And if you want something to grow in the spring, you better not start in the spring. Not a very good idea. What? Yeah, Mishlei, basically this muster, right? You gotta start at least in the summer, in the winter, maybe even the summer before. Don't start in the spring and you're like, where is it now? It comes to the people that have worked before, right? And therefore the year should start earlier. And therefore God should have created the world beginning, not when the spring is ready to the culmination of a cycle. Those are the two theories, more or less.
I have like a basic klutzkash on this.
Yeah.
What are we trying to understand here? Like you said, the beginning is an end. We superimpose our
The universe. And wait, I'm going to get to the universe. We're trying
specifically with the year, the beginning and end of the year. What's that being?
Well, primarily the seasons, like we said. Primarily the seasons, which is how at least agricultural humans live.
Meaning, but there's no reality, like you said, to the order of the seasons. It's all we can formulate any single.
Yeah, I jumped because to go through all the levels would take a few years, but I jumped all the way from like the most basic sense of understanding anything by giving it a beginning and an end, and then talking about cycles, all the way to discussing something very particular and very much less defined, like much less definite, which is the season.
Like there are more or less coherent ways of organizing the seasons for our purposes. Like you said, it doesn't make that much sense to put summer as the first season if you need to start doing things earlier. So far as there's one activity, then we do the first activity of the first season. But beyond that, is there any objective?
Well, it's really harder in the summer, isn't it? It's objective.
Right. Okay. So
the meaning you were saying before, the beginning of the sun's reign. Like
right. So that's also if we think the sun is the most important thing, we want to honor the sun.
I think it really is.
But you can also
everything under the sun, besides the thing beyond.
Couldn't you be any number
everything under the sun is the most important.
That's what I'm saying. So I mean, like your question. What's the study? What do we
okay, good.
Yeah.
Like with the order,
No, I'm with you. I know what you're trying to say. What's the sense of starting?
Like
no, that was what we just answered.
Is that what, are we just trying to say what's the sense of each potential starting point? Or are we trying to say something deeper than that?
No, what I started with, because this seems to me what most people get worried really, like this is all arbitrary. It's not arbitrary that we need starting points to make sense of anything. Of course now we're talking about something much more culturally determined and the natural, like, in the southern hemisphere it's all backwards and therefore nothing along this makes sense. Therefore, like the Valtani said, he shouldn't be able to live in the southern hemisphere, but it was somewhat confusing. I thought the America was in the southern hemisphere, whatever. But, this is... the point is, these things are particular, right? There's some places with no seasons, or places where it's always hot or always cold, and so on. And by the way, the reason why there's no, and traditionally, the people that live in places where it's always hot or always cold are kind of dumb. I don't know if you're allowed to say it, but the traditions of wisdom that we have learned from those people.
The Rambam believed this.
The Rambam believed Aristotle, yeah.
Right,
ancient.
right.
But the reason is because science starts from noticing the cycle of the season. This is like the first science. Now they can be smart because they have other people to tell them science.
Oh, they just have an easier cycle, no?
Nothing happens.
It's always cold. There's no cycle.
You live in the equator. It's always hot, and that's all.
It's just a binary cycle.
It's just always hot.
No, there's no change. It's always cold. Or you're on the
And it's
equator. It's
cloudy
always
always, so
hot.
you can't see
What
the
changes?
stars.
The equator, fine, but
No, I forgot
The
the
Mediterranean climate is ideal for wisdom.
what?
The Mediterranean climate is
It
ideal
is.
for wisdom.
Do you know of wisdom that's somewhere else?
North America.
Tradition of the
Yeah.
Mediterranean. It all goes back to the Mediterranean.
They're sort of on the same line of.
But when you're going back to the particular thing of our seasons, though, and ordering them, what's the study? What's the question?
What?
Well, now that we're away from the universal, we all agree that you need to order things to think about them in some sense. But we're talking about our seasons. What's the question?
Is it a social thing we were trying to figure out? What's the...
No. We're trying to make. So wait. Okay, so now, but like I told you, this is what everyone that does these kind of things does. They start from something very basic and then they jump all the way to something very not basic. And I'm gonna do the same thing. Sorry, like every scientist knows, like there's cause and effect, and now there's like something very. That's just how it is. It just will take a very long time from the basic physical forces all the way to your wife loving you or whatever. Although maybe that's the same thing, but or maybe it's not. The point that I'm trying to get at is that if you get at this, that this is the very basic way of understanding things. Now I said that all this is understanding. So, but the thing is like this. It's somewhat more interesting than that because human beings are not really scientists, or at least most of them aren't. Well, most people are, is people living their life. What we call, and here we get like the difference of from something like called the good and something called the truth or wisdom and ethics or something like that. Of course, traditionally, wisdom is ethics for this reason. What we need, just like, even more importantly, right? Someone could be like a kind of skeptic about nature, and there isn't really any cycles in nature. It's all things that we're imagining to make sense, not to control, not to predict, and so on. That's kind of cute, but you can't live that in your life. There isn't any atheist or any how do you call it? Any skeptic or anyone that pretends. There isn't anyone that pretends that his life has no beginning and end, or even the particular things he does in his life. Like, even people who think that everything is just a mush of atoms pretend to get married and divorced. So the marriage always has a beginning and an end. That's very important. No. Anyways, no. Right? And of course, marriage and divorce both don't exist in nature. They're both human conventions, right? And therefore, we can marry whoever we want, but we still want to have marriage, right? We don't say, it's all one mush, so who cares? And the reason for that, and they also think that it's good, right? And it is good, because what it means to have a good life is something very similar to have an ordered life. Or maybe even the same thing, but just the good order or bad order, which the good is supposed to be more organized. And therefore, even if in some sense it's less basic or can be changed, which is another way of saying that human beings have choice, or that human beings have a morally relevant choice, right? We can have bad orders because we don't follow God's laws. In other words, our nature is a lot more fuzzy than the nature of the sun. You know, the sun is the sun never sins. The moon sometimes sins because it gets smaller, but the sun doesn't ever sin. It's always the same side. And us humans, we can sin, right? Another very interesting thing about humans. No other animal can do that, right? Gershom Shalom said that he's religious because unreligious people could sin.
Bears.
What?
Said bears could sin.
Berries?
Bears.
No, they can't.
No.
They can't. They do all kind of bad. Maybe bad. So they can't just do. They can't be bad. They can't go out of line. It's just bears. So that's what bears do. But human beings, at least from the internal perspective, human beings can sin. And that's another way of saying that the order that we should impose on our lives, or should occur in some order, isn't forced on us. That's one thing, or it's not defined on us. In some sense, need to create it, or in some sense, need to choose it at least. Did I go way too fast? We have something called society and culture, something called all the human institutions, like having children. There's a human, another thing. Animals don't have children. Do you know that? No. Give it a van. They don't. In the same sense, right? Of course, they have children, right? And they don't have. How do you call it? They don't have years. They don't have children. They don't have society in some sense. These things are very complicated. They don't have marriage. There's some birds that can't have marriage and so on. But in any case, this is not the bashing animal program. And it's the point of showing that, and it's important, right? In order for a society to function well, it has to have some concept of you can argue on what the limit, what it should be, and how it should be. But you want it to be in its, to have some concept of what a marriage is and what it's called being your wife, and what kind of actions follow from that, and what kind of actions don't follow, and therefore they're wrong, which means out of the order, stepped out of the line. And for all of these reasons, human beings need to impose order firstly on the most basic thing, which is time. And that's another way of saying that in order for anything to work, and of course there's things that have many different boundaries, or many different limits that we have in order to be good human beings, which means living in conformity with some level of order, and preferably with an order that is true also, or in other words, in some sense natural, in some sense it really exists, because you can definitely make up whichever order you want, if you're creative enough. But hence, usually the people that make whatever order they want end up doing all the same things. It's not so interesting. You could find out what exactly it is if you whatever. But theoretically, you can make up whichever order you want, and some of them might be better or worse, or also some of them might be more closer or further from the reality. And at least one of the basic orders that humans need to live is some kind of periodization of time. Like we have the concept of being a child, and then now child, that's what a second ago about being a child in relation to a parent. But also something of being a child in the sense of a time thing, right? Like age, we have ages. there's a behavior proper to a child, and a behavior proper to a teenager, and a behavior to an adult, and so on. And these things are important. We have, right, one of the important human institutions are coming of age ceremonies, like bar mitzvah or whatever the equivalent to that in other places. And those are like, what is the mitzvah? It's also fate. Nobody really changed when they turn 13 or whatever. I've known them. At some point you change and things, but we create these things in order, like I tell you right now, now you're a man, now you have some responsibilities, now you're expected to fulfill certain roles and all of that. And then, in some sense, and I don't think in all senses, and this will be another whole discussion to define the difference in these things. I mean, I think that a lot of confusions that people have turn out to be figuring out how to sync between different orders in which we do. But one of the basic senses is like another way of saying this would be if you want to like go like in a green field, if you want to like start a society from scratch, the first thing you should do is give them a calendar. This is exactly what God did when He called Moses in Egypt and told him, first you create a calendar. And this is also why China they're trying to destroy the Uyghur society. And one of the things they told them is that you have to follow the Chinese time zone. And there's like police that go around in people's houses and check their phone if they're set to the local time zone, and they put them in jail. And China has this weird thing where the whole China is in one time zone. Because it's part of their imperialism. Like, everyone has to be on Beijing time, and it doesn't matter if you wake up 10 o'clock at night. We want you to work. That makes sense, right? Because that means that should work together with you. It's useful. Of course, it's hard for some people that live in their own place. That's all. But it's the fact that we have, right? When the train came, the Industrial Revolution created these 24 time zones, more or less, the equalized time between cities, so we could communicate and work together. And those things are turn out to be very important. Now, I'm going to finish. This is why having the year start in a certain place is very important. One cool feature of Judaism is that it didn't insist on one time. That's why the first Mishnah says this 4 beginnings of the year. Depending who you are, if you're a Behemoth, it starts in Chodesh Elul. Anyway, depending on who you are, your context, and depending on your tax. We also have that, right? We have tax years and fiscal years and all kind of things like that. But the human one, the most important one, further Rabban and further Chachamim, was, like it says, Rosh Hashana Kol Vayadam as in front of Medrash. And that seems to be the most human thing, and it makes very much sense if you think of the logic that we just said before, about God's beginning. In other words, the full bloom of the world is in Nisan, and that's why when we talk about what God does, like what God does to the Jewish people, takes them out of Egypt, that's Chodesh Nisan. But that, from our perspective, it shouldn't start that. That's the result of some work that you have to start in Chodesh Tishrei. And this is probably, at least one reason why they consider the world, we consider the main Rosh Hashana to start in this month, in Chodesh Tishrei. And now, just to finalize with one word about why this connects to something called Yom Adin. The answer is like this. But of course, each one of these things we have to start and talk all this about. But the thing is that, like I said, there's really 2 things. Each society has their basic categories in which they organize everything, without which you're basically not human. You're not part of the language, not part of it. Right? And what the Torah has is, one is this creation. We call it that's like the theory of reality, how things are. It started and it might end or not, but it's actually important that Judaism has, people talk about a lot, linear concept of time and so on. Beis is important. That's organizes time. Second thing, and the second most important thing, and more particularly we could say the ethical or the question of the good. The second most important innovation of Torah is, or innovation of I don't want to say innovation, I want to say principle of organizing human culture. The principle of order is this concept called Chayva. I know nobody likes it, but I think that we don't like it because we don't realize that this is what it is, and don't get at the root of it. But the concept of if you will be good, it will be good. In other words, the 2 meanings of the word good coming together. Good in the sense of moral good, humans being good, and it being good for you, the world being good. Those things being contingent one on the other. If you will do this, everything will work. If you'll do that, if you'll be bad, things will be bad for you. That is the most important category of organization that the Jewish people have. And of course, everyone else that took it from them and modified them in different ways or whatever. In any case, the whole Tanakh is basically about this, and all Chazal. might have their version of understanding of how exactly. A lot of people don't just figure out how does it work. Doesn't mean that if you turn on a light on Shabbos, lightning comes and kills you. It seems to not work that way. But however way it's supposed to, there's many different. Even initially, there's a theory of how this works, and there's that argues with them, all those kind of things. But the point is that this is like the most basic thing, and therefore, and this is very very nice to realize. Therefore, when we have, this is really the most abstract sense of what we call Terem Nashamayim. You remember that Albo said that there's only three principles in Judaism, which are creation or the existence of God, Schava and Terem Nashamayim. But in the abstract sense, Terem Nashamayim means that the good that we live is true. It means that ethics conform to ontology. It means that being a good person is the same thing as conforming to how God created the world.
How's the difference in Scarvonish?
It's the same thing.
So why is it two principles and not one?
What? They're all, there's only one principle. People don't realize that, so we say it in 3 words. It's the same in the sense that also Scarvonish, you could think the Scarvonish is arbitrary. That's why you say like God decided that you do this and so on. If you understand that as the things that you are to do are rooted in how things are, that's what makes the Tzchal Terem Nashamayim. It makes the Torah divine instead of just a convention, even a divine convention. And now this is why that, and you realize, in other words, when you say like, when we organize time, what we're doing with it is organizing it according to principles, and it's not enough to say, okay, it's a week, right? When I say, okay, a new week starts, as a human being, it gives you some kind of plan for action, or some kind of inspiration for action. Okay, this week I will do and act in the correct way for this week, right? And that, in other words, how the beginning of the week looks, how the beginning of the year, beginning of the month, whatever it is going to depend on your second category for categorization. For example, and just to be clear, what's the opposite theory of Schava and Neshama would be something like power, right? Something like the strong do what they want and the weak must suffer what they must, right? That's in the case theory. And then someone would say it's a new year, and this year the powerful will win and the weak will lose. We'll try to be powerful. And since human life is organized in that way, like we do everything sometime, right? We do the census, counting years, or we pay our taxes based on years, we do everything. So it's going to be in this year, to the extent that a year is important, maybe years are less important, but whatever level of time you're working with, it's going to be, therefore you should organize it, or you're going to be inspired to organize it, or you're going to understand it as being organized by whatever organizes human action in the most basic ways in your thought, in your philosophy. If the most basic principle in for Chazal, and just think from other people who focus on other points, but for Chazal, the most basic principle, the most basic thing that organizes everything is that if you are good, it will be good, and if you are bad, it will be bad. Therefore, when the year begins, they understand it in the same exact way. Therefore, Rosh Hashana is a Yom Adin, precisely because it's the beginning. The beginning is just the principle of organization. And what organizes human life, and distinct from other things, like the animals, Master Behemoth has its own way of organizing itself in some kind of moral sense. But the human moral sense is all organized by this thing called Schava or Din. The most important, and people sometimes also say this thing like, we talk about Malchus Hashem, Rosh Hashana, we talk about Din, and those are two different things. They're the same exact thing, like it says. God reigning in the world is another way of saying that the world is organized in the way that good people have it good and bad people have it bad. And the world that's not working really is another way of saying God doesn't exist or doesn't have providence in the world. And that's obvious. That's why in Tanakh there's no question of God existing. Nobody cares about that. What people care about is it true, like Eov and Kelis, which question, is it true that the world is organized in this way? That is the God. That's the way in which God reigns or controls the world. And that's also the way in which we are to organize our life for these people and to these people. That's why, of course, people that have some slightly different understanding or more complicated understanding of this are going to talk about that in Rosh Hashana. Whatever it is that organizes your year is the thing that you will organize it with. It's as simple as that. That's all.
What's an example of that? That was an
alternate theory?
Yeah.
Ashleim Kalbach.
Can you elaborate?
I don't know. I'm not in this week. I don't know, love and peace or something like that.
No, but are there examples of people like putting that onto Rosh Hashana?
Yeah, of course. That's what they do. Of course, it's an interpretation of Jewish Charbonish, it somehow connects, but anyone that says that the most basic principle of your life should be that God loves you no matter what, is going to tell you that that's what Hashem is about. And as Hashanah, we realize that God loves every yid, and the deepest, the shofar is the sound that has no articulation yet, and at that level you're good.
Is it entirely true that
that if you're good, then you have good?
Yeah.
Oh, that's big.
Isn't that tzaddik like that? Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Yeah, that's the problem of tzaddik barana. That is the question of Rosh Hashana, or of the whole year. The one question though.
So it's not din from an external vantage point, as in, but it's more that this is the opportunity for us to organize.
Well, it depends on how logical or how you describe it. If you say the world is organized by God sitting there and sending notes to everyone for whatever to the malachim to give people rewards and punishment, then that's the way you're going to describe that.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying, insofar as how you're explaining it, it's not that it's the Yom HaDin, it's the Yom HaOrganization.
Yeah, din, of course, there's also Rachman, but that's not real. That's less real, right? Then it doesn't work, so we're going to have some compassion also.
Well, as Zev said, it seems like there's as much achzarius as Rachman. I'm not so sure.
In the world.
No, wait. That's the question. That's a problem for this. There's a very important problem. Just like it. Didn't deny it. There's a very big problem. The biggest problem for this belief system is that it's not clear that the world works that way, and everyone has to figure out what to do with that. If you don't have an answer to that question, then you can't be a yid or some way to deal with it.
Where do we get this principle from, though, to begin with?
The principle that what?
That to be good or whatever.
Tzaddik v'tovlu.
Yeah,
that.
Good. Bad is bad.
So not from reality, right?
No, it is generally true. It's generally truly organized.
No, I'm not saying it's not true.
I don't think it's that not true.
No, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying where do we get where's the starting point? How do we what
Philosophically, it's from this identification of the word good, of the unity of the word good. That's what I think from Plato. In other words, that's how he explains it, right? It's from the identification that good can only mean one thing. And we could say it really backwards, that to be a good human means to have a good life in every sense, of which the moral sense is only one sense. It might be the most important, the least important. These things are not distinct. I think that's where it comes from. Well, another way of saying that the one is the good or something like that, that the good is one. This is also why there's vulgar saying, which saying if you believe in God, everything is good. And if it doesn't look like that, then you're wrong. Right?
You're saying that's sort of a simple way of saying what you.
It's very simple. Yeah, but there's
there's
a very basic intuition or very deep conception that if without that, the other option is sort of Nietzsche, some kind of power theory.
Right.
There isn't really a third option.
And would you say that the beginning of the year just happens to be the most effective time to organize your year, but theoretically you can organize mid-year?
Well, the concept of a year is something that goes back to the.
Or when you organize mid-year,
the years have to begin somewhere.
Right, but if in the middle of in the middle of July I say okay, I'm making a new.
Oh, like I said, there are reasons for there are cultural or even you could say something geographical specific reasons for choosing this time for this kind of thing.
No, I think the big chiddush is that it's just a day of organization. You're organizing two things at once.
The year and yourself.
Correct.
Meaning you're using the starting point for our organization of the external world as an organization of the
Well, according to Bash's Bereshit, the year itself is organized by what is good, right?
Right.
This is where
I thought
it's good for the year
it's more
to be this long.
the day that
and it's also good for humans to act in this way.
Celebrate
In the same sense,
sort of
really.
order.
Of course, we figure that out. But
So we also.
So here's running Rosh Hashana.
Wow.
That is true.
I think that's what he said.
Or
Correct.
Yeah.
And
You're thinking
you could
about
divorce the two, but it would make no sense.
organization.
Yeah,
Well,
I always think
it's
about that.
convenient
But this
and
week when we
symbolic
watched this
and
film, that's what I think of.
reasonable
I think
to-
of it because otherwise it's really, really horrible. There's all this poetry about how things will go so bad for you. Jewish curses, list of curses, you will engage a woman and not marry her. You will have children, but we cannot. It wouldn't be good enough to say you won't have children, right? That would be evil enough. You'll plant a vineyard and watch your enemies drink it. Hello, sir.
Right.
And the only way I make sense of it, or I think this is true, is that these things happen. Okay? Those things happen sometimes. People have children and their wife takes them custody away. And the medrash says that is talking about someone whose wife remarries someone. And how do we make sense of this? This is weird. This is not how it should be. The answer is you sinned. Now it makes sense. By the way, the fact that things make sense is a great consolation. Because really what hurts us is that things don't make sense.
Yeah, but if you didn't sin, then you have a big
don't
problem.
worry. Most people don't have that problem. Ramban says. First find the tzaddik and then we'll talk about tzaddik v'radek, right? First, Hatchelberg tzaddik, okay. Even inventing a sin or something like that. I spoke by the Avnei, it's still, you already have you could say you have some control over your life, or at least that makes your life make sense. I also know what to do. Next year I'll be better. Things will be better for you, and it sometimes works. Not always works.
That's the bad invented order.
It's a story. I don't think it's invented.
If that wasn't actually
I'm just telling you how.
Your host earlier was saying that the best type of order is the order that's actually manifest in reality.
Yeah. This is one. So of course, this is the problem. This is why you shouldn't. That's why we have that. That's why I have tefillah, because if we would just be believing in this, we wouldn't pray, right?
I don't know.
Everything is already organized the correct way. The point of praying and doing tefillah and like all the Rosh Hashana, which is like, it's another way of saying the world is really messed up. Please fix it, right?
So to daven, you need to believe part way.
Yeah, you need to believe that it should. The world should be one way, but it's not that way. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have. It would have a different time. I don't know, just be something else. But
what does it mean to say it should be something? If we're trying to see the sort of order that is manifest and then conduct our lives accordingly, where is the should coming in here?
Should I give like the answers or leave you with a question? Leave you with a question. It should be this way,
Well,
I don't think it's so far-fetched, by the way. Like, for the most part, the good people have a good life in a very general way. Like, I think that a lot of this demand comes from wanting things to be too true, and then nothing in this world is 100%. Sadly, most things, like Aristotle said, nature is for the most part. Sometimes things have to counter nature. And I have a friend that told me he had a dream or something, I don't know, vision, like, came up to heaven, and then he asked him, and he found the malach that has the Excel sheet that tracks everyone's mitzvahs and and like, well, this didn't make sense, that makes sense. So the guy shows him some filters and some pivot charts and everything, and then everything made sense. And it turned out it was everything besides for him. And he said, my life, you see this thick chart, like the whole graph works, but I'm here, what's going on? What's your noise? The Rambam has this whole thing where his answer to the drama of evil is that you should stop caring about yourself so much. Nature is for the most part pretty organized in the sense of like things do work. And the fact that we think it doesn't work is because we're very selfish, and we think that if my life isn't working, then the world isn't working. But in general, like what does he say? The Rambam has like these very, very general things which you take for granted, right? There's air is generally free in most parts of the world, and that's more important for life, so the world is pretty fair. The things that are luxuries that we don't really need that are expensive. Should have been the other way around, you know. A really evil God would have done it the other way. So God isn't fully evil. And any science, all of science is really saying how nature is good, right? It makes sense in some sense. Even evolution is pretty good. I mean, it could have been, different people want to think backwards, like the weak thing, the bad thing should survive. That would be a really bad world. Now, of course, we have the questions, is the definition of good the same definition of good? Okay. But in some sense, it makes sense, right? Precisely because it's correct. The better things, in some sense, win. Of course, it's better defined in the way that we want it. Again, maybe we're very selfish and we want better to mean what makes us happy in a very simple sense, but that's not what better really objectively means. But anyway, that's... So basically, I don't know. You can't like really give up on this idea that the good has to be good. It's not the conclusion, it's really a starting point.
And again, it comes from this.
I mean, just like nobody ever disproved David Hume that there's no order in nature, right? And then like you don't really know that the sun will rise tomorrow. It's just like some induction, and nobody knows that there's no proof. But it would be a very bad starting point to do science from that time. This is good for philosophy of science. If you want to say, well, really, we're just finding irregularities. But as a starting point, you have to believe or pretend, or start from the starting point that things do make sense. That there is causes organized. And in the same way, in the starting point of being a good person, which is another way of making a society or making a good society, your starting point has to be that the good will be rewarded.
Was
And I know some people
is
have
the
a
question
bit
of what is
different
good?
time
Everyone
point.
knows there's some type of activity that's rewarded. We just don't know what it is. I mean, at least that was, let's say, Plato's confusion at some
We don't know
point.
what good is.
Yeah, is it, like you said, is it being strong, or is it being just, or is it being
Well,
smart?
in some sense, it's obvious that the good is not the same thing as being strong.
No, it's sometimes being strong is good.
Yeah.
Or it gets you the good.
The good people need to be strong, but what makes them good is not being
Is it so obvious? Like you said, isn't that just our privilege that we?
No, it's not obvious. But it's the only starting point from which you could make a good become good. I don't think it's obvious. In other words, at least not simple to make it obvious.
Why do we want to become good?
I don't know. Why do we want to understand things? There's only two things that you want to do: is understand things and be good. The question is on anything else. When
I
you
need
answer
to-
for anything else, yeah, because you think it's good, or if you think it makes
Right.
sense. Answer for anything else. This is where it starts. Anyway, this is the basic.
Yeah.
That's all.
So it's the start. What's the end then?
Det är som chefkomt. Ska jag säga för det?
Those are Shana also.
Was it?
Rosh Hashana also.
What do you mean?
Both the beginning and the end.
Oh, the beginning is the same as the end?
It's or orders.
Sorry. Well, the short to get short.
Maybe if you keep on doing this, then things get better.
So what's exactly kapara? This we understand what the end is.
Don't do it. It's not
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question.
What, how are we defining good?
A good question.
Yeah, why do you think it's not the end? Meaning, it seems like the question is what's the best way to live, and the answer of the Torah, and the answer, at least most societies nowadays, is being what we call a good person or a just person or someone who acts in this kind of way, and that'll lead to the second meaning of good, like you said, which is good results. Why are you saying that's the beginning, not the end of this exploration?
I'm saying at the beginning just to answer your question. In other words, just to get away from your question. Because when you say, did I decide that good people have a good life because I looked around and I counted it was good, and then I said that they have a good life? No, because I'm claiming that this is a prerequisite for having a good life, to believe this. Because the funny thing about human being is that we don't actually start without belief. There's another way in which the beginning is the end, right? We don't really, right, remember whoever said that some people think that science starts from observation and then turns to theory, but it really starts with observation, and hopefully sometimes starts with theory, and sometimes observation contradicts the theory and we make a new theory. But we can't start with there's no observations without theory, right? Observations are theory related. Because literally there's the modern, how do you call it, perceptual science or whatever, I forgot what they're called, which explain that your eye can't see anything without concepts and so on, literally. What's it called?
I don't know.
Something processing with a P. Predictive processing. And the point is, and the same thing is with becoming a better person or any kind of progress that you want to make. If you want to come sign, well, in order to have a goal, then you believe that goal is good, you never have to already be there. Thank you very much. The problem is that you're not there. So you're going to have to always start with some belief or something like that. Where do you get your belief? What asking about how the world is and how you are. Or
No, all I know is that I want to be overall happy and satisfied with
That's
my
all.
life.
This is your basic question to repent.
What do you mean?
That you have certain preconceived
No,
a priorities.
I believe that is the case, but I'm just saying that.
And those are somewhat arbitrary also.
But here, my a priori is that I know this sensation in myself. I want to get that, and I look around at other people who have a similar thing. I try to say, in general, what kind of life do they live?
No, it's not a sensation.
I don't mean like a sensation. I just mean a state. A state that I would like to be in, and I try to look around and see who gets that. Is it the strong guy? Is it the smart guy? Is it the guy who is nice? And I'll try to pick up on a general pattern. It's not 100%, and then I'll do that.
Not sure if the sensation that you described at the beginning is something that comes without an idea of what is the good guy.
Okay.
Right? Because, in other words, depends what you want to accomplish. And this is very important. This is why we spend so much effort to try to convince children that if they're good, life will be good for them. I mean, they're not really successful always. But it would be very hard to create anything without that. Just because if you, and also it has to have some truth to it, and some of the truth is actually created by the people that control society who make sure that things are this way. In other words, let's say, gosh, we didn't get so far here. Let's say, it's very hard to talk about life, okay? This is why we have to talk about smaller things. Okay, let's say I go to school for the year, okay? Now I want to be successful, that's a given. I want to be successful in this semester. I don't want to be not successful. Maybe I want to be not successful, then goodbye, not relevant. We're already assuming that I want to be successful, okay? Now what does success consist of? Okay, I already have to, when I say that, I already have to think I know what success consists of. I can't say, well, I'll be observing the whole semester and I'm going to look who the successful people are, and according to that, I will try to do that, whatever they're doing. Well, how are you going to know who's successful without knowing what success is before?
No, you could see the end goal, but you just don't know the means.
Or
to get there.
you have to arbitrarily.
But the
pick
good
it
is a
out.
question of the end, not of the means,
Yeah.
right? In other words, you could say,
No,
what I
it's-
want is to make a lot of money, and then you already decided what is good.
So isn't whatever you think the good is then entirely arbitrary? Or axiomatic, you don't call it arbitrary?
I don't mean by arbitrary, it's what you were taught, generally.
Well, meaning it's not the product of a prior reasoning, because the prior reasoning is always going to be dependent on my prior belief of what I think the good is.
Yes, yes. And in the sense of it can be refined by reasoning. I don't think there's such a, I don't know how much, to what extent there's such a thing as something that starts by reasoning. It seems like a funny myth that people don't believe in.
I agree.
At least in reality it doesn't actually happen. Maybe it could have. But we could hope for it to become closer to the truth by reasoning, to fix our mistakes. But could we do something different? I don't know. And I think if we were honest, then what we think is good is what our parents told us is good, and we could try to make some progress beyond that, hopefully.
What's the process by which you can make progress on that? You can make recourse to any outside information.
by contradiction. In other words, by trying to reconcile this is the Socrates ways, okay? There are other ways, but by trying to reconcile the contradicting things your parents told you are good. Very interesting. Your parents didn't actually teach you what is good because they told you a bunch of confused stuff, because they're human beings. And on one hand they told you that being good is good, on the other hand they told you that having money is good. On the other hand they told you that being accepted in society is good. On the other hand they told you you have to follow the Torah, all kinds of different things. Some of them they told you, some of them they modeled for you, and so on. And you have to reconcile all these things. You also inherit this whole challenge. And to some extent, refining it consists of trying to have a more clear understanding of what it is, not so doing. Of course, your parents also taught you to look at the world that what they teach you is true. So it conforms with reality, which means that you can also have to reconcile that problem. There are some parents that teach their children that what they're teaching them is not true, and those children have no hope.
I think Arlo said one of his axioms is not that, Tzaddik V'Tov is not one of his axioms, and that's something that...
No, I wasn't aware I said that here, but okay.
No, I mean, you're saying you're just you're trying to be open to what the...
I'm open, but I do believe in general, Tzaddik V'Tov, meaning guys who act in a way that we would generally call Tov, the Torah calls Tov, or how even just general pop society calls Tov, generally have good lives.
Yeah.
That's true.
Often.
I think it's
Often,
true.
sometimes.
If you define Tov as stability, then it's sort of true. Or it's easy to say that it's usually
Right. Well, I mean something like
more than half of the time, sure.
yeah, like ordered lives.
Yeah.
I think you were saying.
Well, meaning, I guess the question is why don't we investigate those things empirically, just like any other social question?
We do, but we can't start from that.
In our daily life we can't, but in our investigations of the truth, couldn't we?
Of which truth? Of the question of how the world is or how it should be?
Of what?
Methods.
Of the the means to getting to the end, which is whatever the good, however we
So that's
define
the
what the good
question.
is.
In other words,
Like, let's assume we have the concept of the good, so now the question is, what's the means to get there? The assumption is that doing...
okay, I think that what is good is to know everything. That's the best thing you can do. Now, let's try to find out how this works. So now, I did research. So there's some people that claim to know everything, but they don't know anything. They just read one book and they say everything is in that book. But they don't actually know anything because they can't answer any questions. That's empirical research. And that shows us that method of knowing everything is not actually the answer. This is, by the way, this is a very serious story, right? That's not the way of knowing everything because it turns out they don't know everything, just either deluding themselves or something else.
What book are you referring to?
I keep asking, how do we define good? Wouldn't you have to use a definition of good based off of something other than human?
Exactly. Let's say knowing everything is good.
Right, so either find someone who knew everything or find someone who at least knew something more than you and figure out what they're
Let's
doing.
find out how you exactly. So you do that.
Right.
Why wouldn't you do that? Of course you do that. Well, or if you say good is having the most money, then you should probably find out who has the most money.
But that definition seems fairly arbitrary. Meaning, what would you choose to be the good?
It's arbitrary in the sense of, again, it's not arbitrary in the sense that I got it from nowhere. I got it from somewhere. Is it arbitrary in the sense that I can't make that it's a beginning? It's a beginning point, not an ending point. What's wrong with that? I cannot think or act without a belief.
Well, because the problem is that you make the statement, then the good, acting good begets good results, or however you.
I'll tell you. I'll explain you why we can't do it without anything. Because, part of the belief that actually you get good results is the belief that if you don't do fraud in your science, you get the correct results. That's a belief in Chava that secular people believe in for some reason. Although if you look around in universities, you see the people that make the most money are liars, and the most famous, some of them, whatever, depending on which those you read and so on. But we still believe that those people are actually in hell, right? Although they didn't achieve their goal, their own goal, right? If their goal is to be famous, of course they got famous. But to the extent that their goal should be, or really is to know, they actually know less. But if you are to research the truth, you need to have an ethic that is a correct way, or a good way of researching the truth. And that ethic is just a belief. It's not, nobody promised us. It doesn't even say, some people will tell you, it doesn't say in the Torah that if you follow the scientific method, you will find out the truth. Maybe there's an evil being that's going to do that. The only way to find the truth is to go to the mathematics. I don't know. And then, what you think is the good way of acting, which will lead you to your goal, is actually the opposite. How do you fix that?
But is that reinforced empirically?
Wow.
Like once you pick whatever your good is as an end, and then you see, if I do Ehrlich research, then it gives me good results. So is that like just reinforced over time, or you just at any point it's just an arbitrary theory?
Yeah, of course, but as I said, I don't think we can't fix our beliefs. I don't think we can start from no beliefs. Yeah, of course, and you could even reinforce it and say something like, turns out that this methodology is not a good methodology, it's asking the wrong questions, you should go back and do a different methodology.
So can you ever change what you think the good is based off that?
You can refine it, make it more precise. Yeah.
You presumably can change lesser goods in the face of the greater good.
Okay, but that's
But
because
yeah, you
it's
can't
somewhat
change it.
present already in it.
Right, only derivatives, but you can't change the underlying
Right.
axiom in mind.
Is it, maybe I'm not understanding something.
Okay.
Is good the way it was intended to be? So what makes a good cow a good cow? It's grazing in the yard and
Yeah.
eats, I don't even know.
Right?
That's what makes it a good. So if there's a disabled cow,
It's a bad cow.
Tastes bad.
it's
Yeah, it's a bad cow.
a bad cow.
Not in the moral sense, but.
So it's the way it's intended to be. So
Shouldn't it be in the moral sense if they're really unified?
Yeah, but cows don't have morale.
Well, if they're a unified thing, why not?
Oh, why? Wait, for humans we say that? It depends. Okay, wait. Let's finish the
There you go.
So is that what Tov is? Is that what good is? In other words, good
Okay.
is something that is intended to be whatever it's intended to be. So what are humans intended to be? So it's a
Okay.
philosophical question of what are we supposed to be doing?
Okay, we
And
can,
that
we
would
can do that
define-
research, yeah. We could try if we have some way to figure out what humans are intended to be, yeah. But then we already assume this like concept of what good is.
You already
It's the
assume
definition
that
of what good is, yeah.
good is doing what you're intended to do.
If good is
Or that's
enjoying
what
yourself,
you're saying,
which is not the same
intended
thing.
to do.
Or that you have an
Don't
intent
we
behind
say
your
some
existence,
examples
that's right.
where you hold
Yeah.
as good?
Yeah,
Something
that's-
Like,
Light?
what?
I don't know.
Okay, but
What was the good?
when God calls something good in Parashat Bereshit, that's assuming, of course this is the ground, but assuming that there's some criteria of good before Bereshit, right? God is good by himself, and when he says it's good, it means it conforms with what he thinks it should be, or something like that. But otherwise,
But is that not?
just declaring it to be
So
good.
that-
Isn't that
that's
not
the
how we have to
objective.
define good? As
Yeah, maybe in some sense.
As an objective of whatever it's supposed to be. That's
Right.
literally definitionally what that means. It means whatever it's supposed to be. No?
Yeah, the correct state or the perfect state or something. Yeah. And good is just, if you could take out all the philosophy, right? It's just giving words for how things work. Like you could say, good is just like Aristotle Plato said. Aristotle said, good is what all things want to be. All things aim at the good. If you're not trying to do anything, in other words, you're not aiming at anything, that's the only way you can have a conception of the good.
So is that tautological, that good is just the
Yeah,
thing things are
almost.
aiming
So
at?
there's a big problem with that sentence, but I'm trying to make it this. In other words, you want to act. Action is only something that has a goal, which is what you think is good. So if you tell me I'm going to find out the good without thinking that finding out the good is good, even why you're not doing anything here? Like how would this work? Again, maybe some machine could do that. Maybe there's some instinct somewhere that could do it, but human beings at least they can't do that. Or rational things can't do it. I think that it's a miracle that we can get better. It's a miracle that we can refine our understanding out of the mistakes that we start with.
But you can only ask internal questions. That's the only way to get better.
Yeah, but these internal questions can be pretty far. Right? In other words, you might not recognize the result from the beginning.
Well, your
Right,
ultimate good
right.
could change, but it's just not something that you could prove. But it could be that I thought the good when I was a kid was one thing, and then when I became an adult, it just shifted for whatever reason.
Or you have new experiences.
Yeah,
That's what
but
I'm
the
saying.
shift from
Learn new things.
But not necessarily through contradiction or analysis. I'm saying just,
Right, it just affects the mind somehow.
Isn't your new conception of good just a phrase your first one?
100%.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just saying it's not immutable
Right.
necessarily.
I don't know.
it does have to, if you're going to make sense of it, it has to at least somehow connect to what you thought before.
Or you think you believe in nonsense. Oh,
Well,
No,
thinking
no,
I believe in
why?
nonsense, if there's a way from the nonsense to the corrector thing that you're thinking now,
why does it
it
have
has to speak to each other, right?
No, can there be a leap where like you just get an insight where you just change your mind?
to... My nature changed, right? Before, this was my ultimate objective, and now my ultimate objective is something different. And what it's for X, Y, and Z reason, yeah. Life experience,